It's a kind of instant memory of the things that we all know and see, and then we'll see some slides of works of art in addition. But I want to, in a sense, to give you the impact of the actual city, the kind of city which we know at the present time. Because I think that it seems to me at least that we live in a very special and extraordinary period, a period which has never been in any way approximated in the last 15,000 years. That is, I think we live at a time which constitutes a great start of a whole new way of human life. And the last such major revolution, of course, was the agrarian revolution of at least 15 or 20,000 years ago. And we now stand at the beginning of the industrial scientific revolution, and everything is in this sense a great beginning for us. It's a great and of course a continuous form of astonishment just that we live at this time, and also of course a pain. The Chinese have a delightful curse: may your children be born in an interesting time. And somebody has cursed all of our parents with this, and we are born and now live in an interesting time. And all of the anguish of uncertainty, all of the question, all of the doubt, all of the inability to look back or to rely on any kind of past that really can support us, it is our gift. It is our gift in the German sense of poison as well. So that we live in a very special time, and I think that in a sense we always have to be brought in face with that, with the peculiar sense of the city with which we must now live, of an urbanized society and an industrialized society. And in a way, you see, the great cities of the past, and I always feel that I have to give a tribute to them because I'm essentially a countrywoman and detest them. I feel therefore obliged to speak of the wonders and joys of the city, but it is when I speak of them, I have to speak of the cities of the past, the cities which belong essentially to the agrarian revolution, a city which was set in the country. What we are creating, you see, is not a city set in the country, but a great continuous city, a great stream of concrete, a great imprisoned world, which is going to be the world of our children and grandchildren. So the city, of course, of the olden city, which I think stands in the same relation to the new city as, say, pastoral poetry stands to life on a farm, which is pretty far. You know, there are not many shepherdesses. There are shepherdesses, but they never resemble those in pastoral poetry. You know, they never, and neither, for that matter, do the sheep. In pastoral poetry, always have lovely natures and are, you know, very delightful, clean in the first place, which is not the nature of sheep. And the whole world of pastoral poetry is something which comes in a sense only to people who are not anywhere near the land. And in the same way, the concept of the city as the civitas, as the polis, as the whole great civilizing character of the ancient city is something which we can speak of because I believe it no longer exists. What we have instead is a new thing. What will be named, heaven knows, but it may be just named it, the whole thing. I don't know whether there is any name for it when it embraces the entire experience. And it is this city that we can see, in a sense, in its archaic form at the present time, that I have to speak to you about. I have to speak in this sense only about this future world, which is one that we don't know. Now, in the pictures, I'm going to try to show them to you, the photographs which were done for me by one of my students, Lou Stratton, and which I think, I'll show them to you instead of tell you about them. We can get, in a sense, I hope, an overwhelming feeling of the city that you know. Now, one of the great characters, of course, of the city is its evanescence, is the fact that it disappears, it melts under your eyes. It's the opposite of God's time. Instead of a day being a 1,000 years being as a day, in the city, you see, it's as if it's the other way, that the actual 1,000 years, the day itself, becomes, in a sense, a compression or an expansion of time, whichever way you think of it, into 1,000 years. So that we're astounded if people are still around. And of course, mostly they aren't, as you know. I had a wonderful experience with this today because I was just sitting telephoning and I heard somebody say, why, they still live there. They were living there last year. You know, and it's perfectly marvelous sense. You know, they were surprised and sort of pleased at this sort of traditional life that these people were manifesting by living in the same place for a full year. You know, it was quite marvelous. And this is a kind of news, you know, that comes to us continually. It is the ambient in which we live, the very atmosphere in which we live, which anticipates and expects change and expects disappearance. So when I show you these photographs, they were all taken in the last week, so they have at least a certain contemporary quality. You can go out and say, what, they're still here, you know, but they will have been there only a week. Well, let's look at them if I may have the... Should I turn the lights out here, or do you have a little device at that end? I think this has to be turned up. I want you to be able to... Now, just keep the first one on for a second, please. I see your game. One of the great characteristics of the city, if we can have that first photograph again, is its marvelous illusory quality. I know he has to get this set up, but I want to show you a whole lot of these photographs, so we have to go faster than otherwise. Yeah, that's it. Now, can you see that all right? Is that clear? As clear as it can be, because of course it's one of the things which it has is a great city quality of not knowing where you are. You don't know exactly either where it is or what it is. You are faced by this thing which is itself a thing of beauty, a thing of surface beauty that actually is fraught with a feeling of mystery of where does it begin and where does it end, with the whole quality of anonymity, the whole quality of truly a world in which human beings have very little value. Though by the irony of the nature of the city, it is completely the work of human beings. So it becomes in this a kind of work of art. It is as if it were made entirely without any kind of reference to the natural world. It is a great dream, a great externalized daydream, and a concretized, externalized dream of man, in which man then has to live, and has then continually to confront his own dreaming, his own vision, his own imagination, and confront it in its most radiant and its most extraordinary, because I suppose there's nothing which is more touchingly inhuman than this scene. There is no, in a sense, it is as removed, far more removed than any divinity was ever removed from human life. It is removed in the sense of its extraordinary sleekness, its perfect unbroken front and facade, its gleaming brilliance, all of the things you see which we are not, and of course its great, great size. So that this is a dream made to confront us, made to face us. And with that dream is also, let's look at the next slide, is also its reverse side, or its nightmare side, all of the waste of this world. So that we live in this dream, continually seeing it, and as you can see in this photograph, you feel that there is no end to this. There is no way in which you can ever get out of it. And characteristically, the city presents just man and his image, man and this imagination, this great vision, this dream that is the city. With all the plants are, of course, increasingly becoming simply artificial, man-made plants. The animals are pets, which is a kind of artificial animal. And the whole world then is, in this curious claustrophobic sense, man himself, only at the same time deeply inhuman, deeply antagonistic, or away from or opposed to the nature of man. Let's look at the next slide. And in this, he moves, and in his little wonderful tin box creation of sort of an eternal schizophrenic box, which we call an automobile, which separates him from the world and yet puts him inside of the machine. He is exactly as if armored in a machine. It's as though he were growing an external skeleton and becoming a kind of lobster with the machine as his own skeleton or his own armor. And through this armored world, he moves in his armored box without any kind of encounter with human beings, or whatever encounter that he experiences is in general as this with another box, in which there's of course no, in fact, if there's any effort made to make any kind of correspondence with the person in the other tin box, disaster results. It's the only time that you ever speak to someone is if you run into him, and then you better speak through your attorneys. Let's look at the next slide. Do you think this was made by people? Do you think it was made for people? It's one of the most amazing sights that we have created this, and also its grandeur, its hugeness, is overwhelming. So that continually in the modern city, we are told of our insignificance. We are told this in all kinds of ways. We're told it numerically by the crowds that confront us. We're told that we really do not matter because there's too many of us. Then when we step out into the architecture, it tells us also that we really do not matter. We're too little. We're not mice, we're micro mice. We're smaller than any kind of mice ever were. And also, we are in some way always put off, or this is a kind of mask. It's a mask of the machine which it confronts us when we step out into the street. We are offended by the harshness, by its extraordinary cleanness, its sharpness, by the arrogance and indifference with which it rears itself against us. Let's look at the next slide. I have several of these that I think can over and over, the quality of monotony, the quality, and this is one of the great paradoxes of the life in the city, is that it is at once enormously varied and monotonous, that it pulls between these two conditions, and it is continually threatening to fall into an abyss, really, of monotony. Let's look at the next slide. See, over and over, there is the selection, because this is, after all, you can see these are not organic things that just grew. Somebody at some time drew this, somebody else said, yes, this will do, and somebody else then built it. So that it is the result, it's the external result of endless choices and decisions, all choices and decisions in favor of the mechanical, all choices and decisions in favor of the cold, of the even of the ruthless. Let's look at the next slide. And this, when it is combined with something which is strangely impermanent looking as this, I suppose there's nothing in a way more poignant than those little lights in the roof. You know, it's so wonderful that they exist in that doom 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 like a little piece of music. And if you think just for a moment of the variety of human nature, and then think of that human nature being fitted, each one into these things, each one under this little circular light, each one trying to live some kind of individual, unique human life in this cricket box that has been constructed here for the people to live in. Except even, let's look at the next slide, I think crickets would resent it very much. They would not like that. Because the cricket cages that I know have instead a kind of ingratiation of surfaces which are not continually rebuffing us. And this is one of the things which I think is psychologically extremely difficult for us as people living in the contemporary city, is the terrible shininess and smoothness of the surfaces, which act always to make uncertainty about where they terminate, and also act really as a psychological rebuff. This is one of the strong aspects of rebuff that the city continually deals us, and that I believe has a weakening and continually weakening effect on our own, perhaps on our ego strength, or whatever point that one thinks is any potential strength, our spiritual power. And the smoothness and hardness of the surface acts against us, and acts in a sense to curtail us or to trim our own imaginations. And such a thing as this, it is as if this were some great funnel through which we could be poured or moved, and in which there's no way to stop. There's no point at which we can put out our hands and reach anything which has any kind of human character. Let's look at the next slide. Now, one of the most marvelous things about the contemporary city is the underneath side, or the part which doesn't show, or which is not intended to show, and which reflects really exactly the same quality as the front, only with this curious formal difference. I suppose one of the finest examples of this, which is a structure of great complexity and beauty, looking very much like the Lippold sculpture that some of you know in the United Nations building, and this is to hold up a billboard. Now, this is one of the most perfect instances, and I suppose one of the things which you can experience, and one of the most deeply distressing experiences that is allowable in the 20th century in this moment of archaic technological development, when the actual skills which we have are so much greater than any use at which we put them. And the skill, you can imagine what's on the front of this billboard. The back is a quality, it's like some marvelous needlepoint, or it's like some kind of beautiful complexity of made out by spiders, or by some very inventive and very highly organized engineering principles. And then the front will be a completely fatuous person, or a bowl of cornflakes, or one of my favorites, faultless starch. In the world which is so full of faults, it always delights me that there's one thing that is faultless, and even if it's starch, which I never have too much to do with, I'm glad it exists. So against the fatuousness of the billboard itself is played this extraordinary complexity and this amazing skill. It's the same kind of thing which you can feel, and which I recommend to everyone, just for its chastening qualities, should at least once experience, which is go to a television studio and look at what goes on behind the stage. Look at the machine that broadcasts in one of the most involved and extraordinary and absolutely inconceivable in terms of its complexity, in terms of its mystery, and in the front will be, where it shows, will be some little 5-year-old hula dancing or something, which is a disgrace, a true sin. And this, I think, is the same kind of thing. This is the image which the city produces over and over again of marvelous dexterity, marvelous technical skill toward nothing, or toward real foolishness, or toward actual viciousness. And this stands for that. Let's look at the next slide, though there are endless other instances of it as well. And can you move that a little tiny bit? One of the astonishments of the city is its waste, is the things which are thrown away, the things which stand around, in a sense, are the trimmings from the dream that we see, and their extravagant harshness and strangeness, and the way they create images which I think have never existed before, which act in a sense to predict the ruin of the very smoothness, the very shininess, the very marvelous perfection and geometric flawlessness of the front of the city. The opposite, the destruction, the torn, the broken, the discarded, the dirty, the rusted, the twisted, all of these things lie constantly at hand. Exactly as our torn newspapers, let's look at the next slide, and all of the accumulated debris of human life. Because against this marvelous machine perfection that the city presents is continually played the pathos of the human self. The pathos and dirt, the waste, the whole broken, discarded world, which is constantly being produced in the city, in every city. All over and over again, let's look at the next slide, please. The wonderful things like this paper, you see, it's a perfectly marvelous thing if you just look at it separately, if you don't allow, in a sense, its meaning to invade your consciousness, the meaning of brokenness and of decay. So I think if we had a color slide of this, that you would have what would look very much like a number of contemporary paintings, and that actually aim to convey the same kind of thing. Let's look at the next slide. Here, the wreck of the automobile, that is a part also of continually filling our landscapes with its outrageous and extraordinary shapes. All of that chrome, all of that satin finish, now bent and twisted and turned into wreckage and into waste. But making in it, it's these extraordinary and compelling images of destruction that move along with us. You see, move along constantly, in a sense, beside as a shadow image of the city. Let's look at the next slide. And waste itself, I think the great mounds, the great miles of paper that we continually grind up, and in this fine view of the waste wagons, parade through our cities. I hope that you look at them the next time with some feeling of the meaning which they convey, this meaning of waste, this meaning of the scrapings from the city. And the relationship, let's look at the next slide, the relationship of that to man himself, the strange way in which we accumulate things. This is, I think, one of the most delightful pictures in the world. It's somebody's backyard. Now, there's nothing more heartening, I think, than to see a backyard like this. It makes your own look so much better, you know, than it did before. But we all have this curious accumulation, or this curious wasteful accumulation that is sometimes individually carried, I think, to the kind of pathological extreme which it is here, but which in a way always threatens us, because it is always encroaching on us, it's always pushing near us, it's always coming closer and closer, perhaps because of the extreme slickness and smoothness of the worlds that we live in, of the external worlds that we live in. This silent and deadly accumulation of waste, of objects which cannot be used, or objects which seem to have some kind of potential of use and yet really will only fall apart and decay. This is a part of every experience. We have the next slide. Of everyone's life, despite, I suppose, one of the ways in which we fight against this is by not having any basements and not having any attics, and so people fill their garages with that instead. Now, the man's relation to this world is always anomalous and always a curious and timid relationship, which I think is beautifully illustrated in this, the vastness, the heaviness, the massiveness of these machines, and the little figure of man above. Let's look at the next slide. And he's always in this kind of threat from architecture. I think this is a wonderful, if you raise that a little bit, you can see this is the front of a building along here. It looks, the poor man is bearing the whole weight of this building. And this over and over is apparently what we like, this feeling of massiveness or extraordinary heaviness balanced on very tiny forms, so that man is always in a way threatened or compressed or actually hostilely considered by his own architecture. Let's look at the next slide, where again raise it up a little so that you can see the poor gentleman underneath it. There he comes into view, almost lost in shadow. But over and over, this is the experience which we have, that the architecture has the great power to exist and to affirm itself and to seem as though we know it will not, seem as though it will be there forever. And through that heaviness, that Egyptian massiveness, move the tiny figures of human beings. Let's look at the next slide. And always with the threat, in a sense, of meeting oneself. That is, the mirrored image feeds back to us, and the edges of the world seem to meet and to turn back over on us, so that we are lost in a space that is at once geometric and ill-defined. Let's look at the next slide. I think over and over this feeling, well, that's in sideways. I don't know that should disturb us too much. And you straighten it for... It's in it that you can feel this curious harshness of the forms against the tree form and against this indefiniteness, a geometric precision which is still indefinite. It's like a kind of great modern mathematics, which is the experience, the actual formal experience of the city. Let's look at the next slide. And that deepest and most abiding problem, which is the problem of being uprooted, which almost everyone in the city experiences, and with that uprooting, a sense of wonder about what one is, or whether one can tell really the difference between what is real and what is unreal. And over, the city provides us with that kind of encounter that is continually pushing toward the edge of unreality, and making a combination, as this makes a combination, of the beautiful and distant and artificial, and the familiar and close and plain. And the two worlds continually play against each other and interpenetrate until in many ways, let's look at the next slide, it's almost impossible to find where one is. I think this is a marvelous instance of it. Will you raise that up a little bit? Because you cannot, these men are bankers, and I think never in the history of the world did bankers have to have so illusory a life, or so a life which seemed as indefinite. And this is perhaps a function of credit or some such thing that makes us open out the banks and turn them into this kind of dream world. Let's look at the next slide. Over and over we encounter things that seem to be of one order of reality, and then as we look at them, of course, they become another. These wonderful mannequins conducting their pleasant social evening in the middle of an otherwise entirely deserted city are a part of that kind of experience. And let's look at the next one. And over we find the world of unreality, the world of some gorgeous beauty and sumptuousness let's have the next slide. That turns into, just as we look at it, turns into a mannequin. And what is the soulful look and the voluptuous half-open mouth is just telling us that it's $4.95 or $49.50 or whatever it is. It's a curious kind of imbalance between the emotional weight and the actual meaning. It's the kind of thing which, of course, is continually a part of our visual and experience in commercial, any aspect of selling, and is poignantly true in our relation to, say, television selling, where the passion with which the pitch is delivered has no bearing whatever on the actual feeling, which is even meant to be conveyed. I think this has taken a great step forward, and which is to say backwards recently, by the commercial tunes that have become very strongly affected by jazz and by folk tunes. Have you all noticed that on television? I heard one the other day that I thought, my, that certainly is, the language is getting very coarse, and it was about pat of cookies. And, well, the way it was delivered, you see, with this very strong beat and this insinuating, sexy voice, you would have thought that the meaning was something entirely different, you know. And instead you were being invited to taste some, actually, to buy some cookies. Really cookies, not what it sounded like. Let's look at the next slide. This development in billboards is my favorite because it seems such a late time for cubism to be striking commercial art, and I hope that all of you have enjoyed them as much as I have, as they shift and change. It's a perfect, an invention which is perfectly suited to our time, that fragmentation which then shapes again to form another kind of meaning, and then is again fragmented and again forms another meaning. Let's look at the next slide, please. And this perfect example of the, in a sense, spontaneous creation of art through disaster or through the destruction of some other forms or other meanings. This is the kind of thing which happens over and over on billboards where various meanings fuse and recreate themselves, so that actually they become a work of art of great mystery and great fascination. When they are no longer useful, they enter that realm of time or that realm of distance where they can function poetically. Let's look at the next slide. And I think this is one of the great gifts of the city, and of course it's one of the things which the artists have used continually. We are continually in the city amazed to find that we can't tell the difference between creation and destruction. The building, we don't know whether it's being built or being torn down. It is, and in fact, both of these things can happen in very short order. So it isn't maybe even necessary to be able to tell this difference. But again, it is one where we see the track of previous experience, or we anticipate future experience, and it is revealed to us. It's open to us. We have to participate in it. It is unveiled, and we move into past lives or into future lives continually by the construction and the destruction in the city itself. Let's look at the next stuff. And then that great possibility which the city has for us, that is one of the most electrifying and one of the most terrifying, the encounter with the human being. That is absolutely inexplicable. Today I was driving in Hollywood, and I looked out of the corner of my eye, and there was a man completely dressed in white with long white hair and a long white beard, feeding pigeons. He was surrounded by pigeons. And the sight of this, you see, was so electrifying and so absolutely mysterious. And I will never know any more about it, you see. Never know any. I don't know where he came from. I don't know where he was going. I don't know whether he always feeds pigeons in white clothes. In white clothes feeds pigeons. I don't know anything about it. I don't know whether he was a part of something and I only saw this fragment, or whether he was the whole thing, that's just his entire life. The same as this man, you see, who against the city has constructed, you can feel, you see, this extraordinary self, this strange, amazing self, carrying these great boxes of nothing. They've got to be nothing, having so many burdens that he's unable to ride but must now walk. And those burdens filled with the very thing which the city can give us, these marvelous boxes of what? And we never know. And he moves himself as a marvelous box among these boxes, filled with his own mystery. We will never see him again, almost certainly. We never have seen him before. And this is the kind of encounter which is at once, you see, the magic and the despair of the city. It is the kind of thing which we suffer from and which we enjoy. Let's look at the next slide. I have these two delightful scenes of a man being told, don't walk, and looking as happy as you please, because over and over, you see, we're admonished by signs. I once read a Frenchman's remark about traffic lights, in which he said, I can't imagine anyone paying any attention to them. And you see, we are so easily admonished, it doesn't occur to us. I think it's only lately, they've begun telling us don't walk, which I do resent. I want to be permitted to read those lights as I see them, you see, not be told, don't walk, don't walk, don't walk, and then when it begins that, the frenzied business of don't walk, don't walk, don't walk, it is extremely irritating to me. I think that we should be allowed to read the signs in terms of the lights without having the word in addition. And these people very humbly standing still, they're being told don't walk above. Pull them down for a minute. Can you lower that a minute so we can be sure we see? Let's look at the next slide. You see, there is continually, I think this is so marvelous, and I entirely agree with you that it's an impossibly dreadful and marvelous thing. They add the boldness and the didacticism in this hand is something that is just terrifying, and it's deliberate choice of vulgarity. You see, it makes me so angry that they would make a thumb like this. You see, that it's the most aggressive, disagreeable, dreadful thumb that anybody could draw. And they drew this on the wall. They made this awful bending back, fat, piggy thumb, and then put on it this elegant, slender finger, you see, pointing down. And it is the choice that went on here. The choice is the choice of the coarsest, the most vulgar kind. It's the choice of a deliberate mechanism, a kind of slap-in-the-face mechanism, the same kind of mechanism that you have in the voice of, this is a recording, that the deliberate use of a voice that tries to be a machine. You see, when it would be just exactly as easy for them to say, this is a recording, or, something which was more casual and human, but they turned this into being an inhuman form by deliberation, by deliberate selection, exactly as this is turned into that, the same, and the aggressiveness of it, the assault on the psyche, the indifference to everything which is of any kind of human value that's simply in this very drawing is, and of course when you consider, that it's 3 or 4 or 5 stories high, in addition to being the greatest extravaganza of vulgarity, it is almost more than one can bear. Now let's look at the next slide. Now, what does the artist do when he faces this? He does exactly what he has always done, which is that he shows it to us again. And he has varying possibilities or attitudes toward it. One may be an attitude of delight and worship, as in this case of Sheeler's painting of the city. And Sheeler, in his Charles Sheeler, was the man still painting, and I suppose one of the great American painters, who in the early years of his career sang the most continuous, delighted song of praise of the very things that the city constitutes, the very things which can turn into its poisonous quality. The quality of extreme smoothness, of cleanliness, of sharpness, of clarity, of absolute indifference to the natural world, which is his great affirmation, you see in this. His affirmation is an affirmation of the power of man to create a world, to create and to live in a world. And this world, one which is his, in a sense, deeply his own invention, so that it has no reference to the suavities of nature or to the undulations and ease and graciousness and raggedness of the natural world, and affirms instead the geometry, the space, that ordered space that the city can create. Let's look at the next slide. And over he presents this image with delighting in the very things which can become burdensome, the marvelous regularity, the wonderful precision of these windows, the windows with nothing in them, you see, nobody in them and nothing in them. The great hive created with the strongest sense of the flight of man's imagination, the flight in terms of the machine, in terms of this world, of this mechanical and geometric world. Let's look at the next slide. And it soars. This world reaches up to the heights. It reaches as the cathedral reached, in a sense, to explore space, to discover and to scratch at the heaven itself, and without turning any look in a single eye in a way toward the people who made it, not making any place for the mind or the soul or the imagination to rest. Instead, asserting this in the same way that a great machine asserts it. Let's look at the next slide. And here you have one of his paintings of the machine. Always likes me to show to people because they always think it's a photograph. And it's almost impossible to believe that it is a painting. The kind of devotion, the kind of love, the kind of delight that can make a picture like this, that can look at the machine and see it as something which must be hovered over, which must be looked at and devotedly examined and then set down. This kind of devotion Sheeler had, and we can feel the whole majesty, the whole marvel of the machine, of the relationship of wheels to wheels, of gears, of this whole, this entire world, mysterious and marvelous and seeming to have a kind of life of its own. And let's look at the next slide, because these two go together, these two paintings. You see that you can see the machine so pink and exquisite is a gift of Sheeler's imagination, that he can see it, and that he is able to love this quality of unwrinkled, clean, flawless perfection of metal. To bring to that the kind of attention, the kind of delight that the artist must bring if he is going to make a picture of this degree of attention or accuracy. See, this is not something which can ever be done in hate, and it's nothing which can ever be done in haste. It is only done in time and in love, and only through the willingness to look, and to exactingly and devoutly set down the thing which is seen. Now he could bring that, let's look at the next slide, to the machine world, and even to the world of the machine extending out and destroying the natural world, or the world of the earth, so that this great thrust of the city into the country is affirmed by him in the same way that the machine itself is affirmed. Let's look at the next slide. Another apotheosis of the city is in the work of Irene Rice Pereira, who shows us the beauty and the mystery of the surface of the city, and of that surface in light and at night. One of the most ingratiating, one of the most delightful, one of the most beautiful visions which the city offers us is itself at night, as if light were the only medium which can suitably convey its very evanescence, its very passing brilliance. And the joy which everyone feels, I think, when everything is lost in darkness except the lights themselves. Then this becomes a poem. Then this becomes so beautiful that it is one of the most exciting and one of the most stimulating creations of the human imagination that has ever existed. To see the city at night, to come into it from an airplane, to see it from a hill. And some of that mixing, shifting brilliance is caught in this painting. Let's look at the next slide. Seems almost to move, doesn't it? And then that great pulsing rhythm of the city, the swinging, pounding power of the city. This artists have captured from the very beginning of this century. This is by Joseph Stella, a painting of the bridge, and some of the marvel of the imagination of man that can create a city, that can make this great wonder, that can make this elaboration, this complexity, this marvel exist at all, can throw it up before our astounded eyes, and can see that it works to the degree that it works. This is the kind of thing which is always the delight of looking at the freeways at about 5 a.m. At any other time, it's not as pleasant. But the city, when it can be seen, and I often think that if we can destroy ourselves without destroying the cities, it'll be a beautiful sight for the angels or whoever is interested, because it is of this kind of order, a great achievement of man. Let's look at the next slide. And in sculpture, there's the same power that contemporary artists have to make us see the beauty of the fragmentation of these forms, the beauty of metal itself, of the perfection of the clean-cut metal form. That is a new form, that is not, it seems in a way indifferent to or actually antagonistic to our human shapes, but in which we perhaps can rejoice even more because it is unlike ourselves. And the brilliance, the lightness, the gaiety, the charm of Calder's mobiles, I think, are a continual testimony to this. And the reason that his work is so popular, because it has become, I think, in recent times extremely popular, is because it is a little jingle, a little poem about the perfection of the cutting of metal, about the balance and swinging of forms, about the delicacy and lightness in the machine world. Let's look at the next slide. Or even in such a thing as this, where the sheer pleasure which we as 20th century people have in the beauty of the turn of metal, in the beauty of the surface of metal, the delight that we have in the anonymous and mysterious form shaped out of metal, becomes one of the testimonies to this kind of delight, or this kind of joy. Let's look at the next slide. I think this is one of the ways in which the artist takes, almost excises from his world some fragment of beauty and presents it to us. If I told you that this was not a piece of sculpture, but a part of what? Some chemical laboratory equipment, some part of a plastics factory, some part of the spindle of some machine, it would be perfectly believable to us. It has the polish, it has the balance, it has the humility of form that is a potential usefulness. It has this potential usefulness. And it is enjoying this quality. It is, in a way, in love with this quality. Let's look at the next slide. But over and over, the very perfection, the very polish, the very machined elegance of the city wears on the imagination. And over, the artist turns to that world of waste, or that world of the discarded, or that world which is absolutely without any kind of polish or any kind of perfection or any kind of geometry, that exploits instead the suddenness of the wasted and eroded form, and presents to us this kind of encounter, this encounter with the torn, the jagged, the corrupted, the broken, that is a continuous part of the shadow self of the city. And let's look at the next slide. Over and over, this is the theme of contemporary artists. It is the thing which he presents to us, which he shows us, not the rhythm of the bridge, but the curious, twisted, tangled, and terrifying rhythm of the speed of the city, of the way that we are caught up in speed, and we're caught up in a kind of flight from disaster, as if we had to move faster, we had to run, we had to race, we had to drive faster, we had to make the next light, even when we have no reason whatever to make the next light, except the very pressure of the light itself. And this kind of turbulence, or this kind of anguish of the city rhythms, is caught by the contemporary artist, caught by Pollock, and constitutes, I suppose, one of his greatest charms, or one of the ways in which he interests more people, is in this very sense of his capacity to deal with these destructive forces, or his desire to deal with them and to show them to us, to show them the pull and tug and thrust and counter-thrust of the life that we lead as city people. Let's look at the next slide. Not at all concerned, you see, with the kind of beauty that the previous artists were concerned with, and not, of course, at all concerned with the traditional concept of that, but instead with this, the breaking and the roughness, the breaking into roughness of life in the city, that is continually wavering or moving toward a collapse of that geometry, a collapse of that smoothness, a collapse of that refinement of the external forms. Let's look at the next slide. Until very often in contemporary city expression, the artist makes what is like a scrawl, as if he wanted to tell us that the planned is too much a prison, that the designed and the shaped and the polished cannot be justified, that the slap, the scrawl, the sudden intrusion just of his own human self, his own track, is all that he wishes to say. And this encounter is like the encounter with the man on the bicycle. It has no, in a sense, no beginning and no end. It therefore moves continually toward meaninglessness. It moves constantly on the edge of the threat of the absurd, or the pointless, or the foolish. Let's look at the next slide. And sometimes exploits the quality of a kind of innocence or a kind of anger that is as primitive as it can be. It is like something scrawled on the wall. It is like the untrained. It is in answer to the great technical push of the city, the continuous oppression of technical exactitude, of requirement, of the pressure of time, of the pressure of place, of the pressure of the professionalism of city life. Let's look at the next slide, please. And against that, the artist over and over at the present time plays an absolute quietness, an aim at blankness, which is continually threatened with the feeling of apathy or of a dream so profound that it cannot speak beyond itself. It is as if the very plethora of experience of the city requires blankness, requires silence, requires nothingness. And the artist presents what is as near and sometimes, of course, clear into nothingness, as near the youthful, the undefined, the unexperienceable in the actual world. These act really as, in the same way, I suppose, as our drugs act. They act hypnotically. They act to quiet the terrible rush and thrust of city life. And their power is that they have this ability. And the mistake that people make is asking that they should provide experience. They are a hiatus. They move away from the accumulation, the pressure, the complexity, the involvement of the city, and act in a sense as a green and quiet place. Let's look at the next slide. And if they are in a way permitted to do this, which of course for many people they cannot be. That is, there is something in the very character of our lives as city people that requires more and more novelty, more and more experience. Instead of the power to leave experience alone, we demand more and more. So that many people confronted by this find nothing at all is intolerable. That this is intolerable, that what they need is the continuous spur of new experience. Now, these artists, whether one agrees with them or not, are presenting this kind of moment of quiet. Let's look at the next slide. And some of the mystery of quiet, some of it acts almost as a hypnotic, as a device to center and quiet the vision. Vision constantly caught. I suppose that we at this time move our eyes more rapidly just in order to survive, just to live, than people have since Paleolithic times. We have to watch. And the joy of opening the eyes and letting them, in a sense, roam quietly is the aim of this kind of work. Let's look at the next slide. Now, one of the responses of the artist to this city scene is the response of deliberate selection of waste material. It is as if he saw all of this waste world as the world of greatest value. It is a curious expression in art of the same kind of thing I think that you had in that wonderful backyard. The feeling that out of nothingness, out of the cheapest materials, the outcast, the thing thrown away, that the thing of greatest value can be made. And this stitched and bedraggled form, which is completely antagonistic to any kind of idea of beauty or any kind of idea of polish or any idea at all of the depiction of anything, is one of the responses of the 20th century artist to the city. I think it is really as if the wound of the city is so great that the wound itself and all of its waste product must be elevated to a divine experience. And over, this kind of tattered, cluttered, ragged soiled world is shown to us. Let's look at the next slide. I think in this one, you see, it is saying that the thing that people think of as art is inappropriate or impossible in the face of the experience of the city. That our peculiar, tattery human selves have to find something which is in a way as tattery and peculiar as we are. And that nothing in the city itself reaches this degree of decomposition. Nothing is as wrinkly and sorrowful unless it is made by man as wrinkled and sorrowful. So that in this we can find some rest. Rest from newness, rest from, again, from the hard surface, the brilliant surface, the harsh, resistant surface of our world. Let's look at the next slide. Now, how is man to be considered by the artist? And here the artist is almost overwhelmed by the power of the city itself. So that to imagine a human being is really to imagine something which can exist in the city. And this wonderfully armored and shiny creature would have no trouble at all, would fit exactly into those buildings, would be perfectly happy in those automobiles, and when he is no longer any good, would make a very nice raggedy piece of sculpture. As it is, he makes a very brilliant and polished one. He is as shiny as any surface that you could discover. And in this he constitutes a suitable person for the 20th century. Let's look at the next one, who is in some ways even better for the 20th century, because fully as polished and much narrower, so that the great 20th century problem of population and of fatness both can be overcome by this figure that fits into this strange little coffin shape of its own sleep or of its own death, however you wish to conceive of it. And let's look at the next one, perhaps even smaller. This is called figure, so that you will know. It is also the presentation of the ideal that fits this world. This smoothness, this anonymity, this hardness of surface, this lack of any kind of personal actuality has become an ideal which fits the world that we just saw. Let's look at the next slide, which is more alarming. And this is called child. And I think that you'd be interested to know that the medium is nylon and wax. And there's something suitable about that. But the child, the image of the child, and the concept of the child, which is one of the great plagues of the 20th century, one of the ways, I suppose, that any society would stand so terribly on the brink of changes that it cannot anticipate, must consider the child, and consider the child in a sense as threat. This one, caught in these webs of wax, belongs to that disordered and wasteful side of the city world. Let's look at the next slide. Another figure of man, this one welded and composed out of its wonderful and powerful surfaces of metal, able to withstand any assault of the city, of its noise, of its smell, of its violence. This is the figure of man which can emerge in the artist's imagination as that suitable to our time, taking on a strange hieratic and idle form, so that one stands in front of it, as one stands in front of all human beings, the present time absolutely unable to comprehend any part of what constitutes their mystery. Let's look at the next slide. Now the artists at the present time, and remember the evanescence of the city, are caught up in the desire to break all the previous forms of consideration of sculpture and painting, so that they no longer possible to speak of a sculptor or a painter. It is the work is both painted sculpture or sculpted pictures, and it is composed out of the things which are thrown away, or the things which are part of the junk and waste of our time, or are a new vision of something which is itself an article of manufacture. This is called a bird, and is, as you can see, is made up of junk, and is intended to convey to us the poetry of discard, the poetry of waste. Let's look at the next slide, which is another aspect of this. Just a target, and what is the meaning of target? And of course, in our troubled times, we are afraid that we are targets. And this artist paints targets of all sizes and all colors. In case you didn't understand the first target, he hopes you will the fifth or sixth. Let's look at the next slide. This is a movement, you see, away from any kind of previous idea. Any of the things which people used to think were a part of what art was about, things like composition, pictorial organization, the various things such as techniques. These are all of no interest to these young men, because most of these artists are young, that is in their early 30s, and their concern is a new concern, but it is one with the city. It belongs in the city, and it can really only exist in the city. This is called underwater plants, and they do